Sometimes, when people talk and write about poetry, they end up saying things that leave me thinking, so what? They might work out that a poem is written in a particular metre, like iambic pentameter or trochaic tetrameter. Perhaps they'll notice, too, that a poem has a specific rhyme scheme or stanzaic form, and so refer to sonnets and couplets and quatrains. While they're at it, they may also point out things like alliteration and assonance, decasyllabic lines, voltas and refrains. Now, all of these terms, and many more like them, are useful technical terms for describing poetry. Honestly, they are. And it is not the existence of a specialist vocabulary that sometimes leaves me scratching my head. Rather, the question I sometimes ask myself is, how does this sort of description add to my understanding of a poem? And is it something readers do just for the sake of it, or to make poetry reading difficult and inaccessible? Do they do it just to satisfy some sort of assessment objective, or because that is how we are all supposed to read a poem? I'm sure I'm not the only reader who has sometimes asked, why is it important to do this? Why does it actually matter? Thinking about these whys is going to be one of my focuses in these videos. Observing how a poem is written is a good first step in any close reading, but when it comes to communicating this, well, there should be a reason to do so. This is to say, it is important to know how to move from observations about a poem to an argument about that poem and why it matters that it takes a particular form. But where might you begin? Well, have a look at this poem.
The Tyger. Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer? What the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil? What dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?
This is a very well-known poem by a very well-known poet. It is William Blake's The Tyger, and it is a poem that raises a lot of questions, quite literally, because it is a poem that asks a lot of questions, questions that are left unanswered. Just look at all those question marks. In particular, readers have wondered what the tiger is supposed to represent. And noting that the poem is full of dynamic, physical, industrial, even apocalyptic language and imagery, they have naturally placed it within the context of revolution. This makes sense, because the poem was written in the latter part of the 18th century, in a time when the spirit of revolution was live. There had been political revolutions in America and France in the name of freedom, liberty and justice that resolved themselves through violence and terror. In England, technological developments led to an industrial revolution, but this was not without socio-economic costs for many ordinary people, for whom progress meant poverty, toil and ill health. Are these the revolutionary energies that reside in Blake's poem, readers have asked? And how do they interact with Blake's personal philosophy and theology, particularly his concern for the human spirit and its oppression by various authorities? It is certainly worth thinking about. But what does the fact that The Tyger is a poem have to do with this? How does the sense that there are dynamic energies in the tiger also relate to its form? The inquiry is one that the poem itself prompts, in a question that is posed not once, but twice. It is asked, at the poem's beginning and end, what immortal hand or eye could or dare frame thy fearful symmetry? And one non-theological answer to this is, of course, the poet, William Blake. It is he who is responsible for giving the tiger verbal and visual shape, for framing its fearful symmetry. And notice how he does this through a symmetrical framing device. Blake's final stanza is a repeat of his first. It frames the poem in a quite literal manner. This poem about a tiger's fearful symmetry is itself symmetrical. One way to think about the poem's form in relation to its content, then, is to explore how the potentially disruptive, creative and revolutionary energies that the tiger is thought to represent are framed and organised through symmetrical structures. Symmetries are discoverable throughout the poem. See how the first line is divided in two orally. Two stressed consonants in the first part of the line are mirrored in the second part by a different pair of stressed consonants. And just as this line begins on a stressed syllable, so it ends on one. Moreover, just as this line begins with the T sound in tiger, so it ends with the T sound in bright. The next line is also balanced. It, too, begins and ends with a stress, because Blake's line is a shortened trochaic tetrameter line. This is to say that the final trochee in this line has lost its unstressed syllable. In the forests of the night. The technical term for this is catalexis, but I will explore Blake's handling of rhythm in more detail in another video, so be sure to subscribe and to turn on notifications so that you don't miss that. What matters for the moment is that because Blake's line is short metrically, here as elsewhere, then it is also symmetrical. It begins and ends on a stressed syllable, but there is more. Look again at which sounds are stressed in this line. Do you see how these mirror one another perfectly? This is called oral chiasmus, which simply means that the sounds of the line have been repeated in reverse order. It is a really specific example of symmetry in the tiger's construction, and this sort of patterning repeats itself elsewhere. Look at the poem's third stanza and how it has been designed. You might have noticed that the first and fourth lines each have 7 syllables, while the middle lines each have 8. An extra syllable appears at the beginning of these longer lines and not at the end, as you would expect from a trochaic rhythm. The result is that this stanza's middle lines are actually iambic in rhythm, whereas its first and fourth lines are trochaic. This is to say that the stanza is formed of 2 couplets that reflect one another rhythmically. Do you also see how the first and fourth lines are split into 2 grammatical units, whereas the second and third lines are not? This is another example of symmetry in the stanza. But do a little more digging and count the number of syllables between each mark of punctuation. A very particular syllabic pattern emerges, where the second couplet exactly mirrors the first. And this degree of balance and symmetry does not just occur by accident. On the contrary, Blake can be seen to have adapted the same pattern in his very next stanza, except on this occasion each line is the same length and rhythm. So, symmetrical structures are clearly a feature of Blake's poem, appropriately, given that it is a poem that begins and ends by asking who could or would dare frame the tiger's symmetry. This is the word on which the entire poem ends. But hang on a moment. Already in the course of this discussion, I have said that some of Blake's lines are metrically short, whereas others are longer, and that these lines are different rhythmically. Blake's shorter lines are trochaic, whereas his longer lines are iambic. I've also said that the syntactical patterning of Blake's third stanza is not repeated exactly in his fourth stanza, but is varied. This sort of variety is common in poetry, but it is also an aspect not of symmetry, but of asymmetry. I'll give you another example of what I mean. Look at Blake's fifth stanza. As is the case throughout the poem, this is a stanza of 2 couplets, and each line carries 4 stresses. In each couplet, the first line of 7 syllables is trochaic, while the second line of 8 syllables is iambic, because they begin with an additional unstressed syllable. The 2 couplets therefore parallel one another, they are balanced, and the stanza itself is symmetrical. But this overall symmetry is arrived at through asymmetrical structures. Within each couplet, line lengths and rhythms change. This is even the case in Blake's 3rd and 4th lines, which begin with exactly the same 2 words. Pay attention to how "did he" is stressed in 2 different ways. In the first case, "did he smile his work to see," with the emphasis on "did," while in the second, "did he who made the lamb make thee," with an emphasis on he. When you look back through the rest of the poem, you'll notice more asymmetries. Those repeated T sounds in Tyger, Tyger are not reflected perfectly, but become B sounds in the second part of the line. Perhaps the most conspicuous of these asymmetries is that Blake's final stanza does not repeat the first exactly. At the end of the poem, it is not asked whether it is possible to frame the Tyger's fearful symmetry, but whether it should even be attempted. What sort of being could do this? The first stanza wonders, while the last asks, what sort of being dare do this? This change from could to dare can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but what is certain is that Blake thought about it. Earlier drafts of the poem exist, and in one Blake cannot decide which of the 2 words to use in the first stanza. He writes in could and then crosses it out, and then he writes in dare, but he crosses that out too. While in another draft he uses dare in both the first and the last stanzas. What this suggests is that asymmetry is integral to the design of the poem, that asymmetrical structures in the Tyger are as considered as its symmetrical structures, that they exist because they are meant to exist. Perhaps this is because one cannot exist without the other. All of Blake's lines that are only 7 syllables are symmetrical, inasmuch as they begin and end on a stressed syllable, but because of this they are also asymmetrical, since they have been shortened and are missing an unstressed syllable. The 2 go hand in hand. Which makes me think. The Tyger appears in a book called Songs of Innocence and of Experience, a collection of poems that intended to show the 2 contrary states of the human soul. Is it conceivable then that the interaction between symmetrical and asymmetrical structures in the Tyger is actually an aspect of this exploration of the contrary states of innocence and of experience? It is an idea that I will return to in another video. But take one final look at the line in which this critical word symmetry appears, and consider 3 things. First, that this is the very first line in Blake's poem that deviates from the rhythmical norm that is established in the rest of the stanza, because it is a line of 8 syllables, not 7. Within its stanza, therefore, this line is marked by difference. It is a regular line, but it is irregular in comparison to what has come before. And this is also the note on which the entire poem ends, because, of course, this is also the very last line of the poem. Second, how are you meant to say the words could and dare in these 2 lines? Some readers emphasize them, while others do not, and some will stress dare, but not could. There is unpredictability here. This imperfectly repeated line has the potential to go astray. Third, have you ever heard anyone read this poem in such a way that symmetry actually rhymes with I? I'm not sure that I have. I know I is meant to be pronounced in the modern way, because elsewhere Blake rhymes I's with words like arise, surprise, sighs, and cries. But as far as I know, Blake does not use symmetry again in a rhyming pair, so I cannot be sure how Blake pronounced it, or if it is supposed to rhyme with I. What is clear, however, is that in modern readings it does not. In modern readings, the I-symmetry pair is the only non-rhyming couplet in Blake's poem. In modern readings, the word symmetry therefore always announces its own asymmetry, because it does not rhyme. In the Tyger, then, attention is drawn to the very idea of symmetry, but in a line that is, in a variety of ways, structurally unbalanced. And perhaps this is reflected in the curious way in which symmetry is described in the Tyger as fearful. Fearful can mean terrible, dreadful, and shocking, but it can also mean afraid, nervous, and scared. Might the Tyger's symmetry be fearful because it emerges from or gives order to asymmetry? Or perhaps it is fearful because balance and harmony might always be consumed by their opposites of disorder and chaos? Might asymmetry in Blake's poem represent a revolutionary energy that has the potential to disrupt or change an otherwise ordered world? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if there are any poems that you think I should discuss in the future. And if you've enjoyed this video, give it a like and click the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future releases. Look after yourselves and keep on reading.